of racialized contours of global capitalism have kind of been exposed. Towards the end of May, when George Floyd was unfortunately murdered in Minneapolis, this seemed to kick off a kind of sway of protests in the US and then also in the UK around ideas of racism, racial inequality, but also wider class issues and just basic neglect by government and state. And we kind of want to bring those conversations together and reflect on how different parts of the movement are doing things. So, you know, the most iconic movement in Britain last couple of weeks ago was the felling of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol, which for years people had tried to take down. Colston was an enslaver who benefited very much from slavery. He was tossed into the harbor, has seemingly been retrieved, but that moment has kind of largely been constrained within a culture war. But what we want to kind of bring into is the demands in the UK are very much aligned with the demands in the US, which are really around race and class and also gender domination, right? And that's basically where we are. And we've also then trying to stretch that out and say, well, what does this mean for the idea of imperialism? How does the move for Black lives center the struggle for justice around the world? And how does that kind of give us a kind of momentum moving forwards, hopefully at some point past this pandemic? All right, so that's kind of where we are. And we have a fabulous range of speakers that will each have up to 10 minutes. You don't have to take the 10 minutes. You can always cut it a bit short and we can kick off more discussion. So I hand over to Lucia, who will introduce each speaker as they come on board.
Yes. Thank you, John. So as I said, we have a very nice, exciting group of speakers today. I also wanted to add that this meeting has been supported by our local UCU branch, and we hope that this discussion will also contribute to drafting a collective statement with staff and students on our support for the Black Lives Matter movement. The first speaker today is Professor August Nimtz. Is a professor of political science and African American and African studies at the University of Minnesota. Our second speaker is Lester Spence, who's also professor of political science and African studies at Johns Hopkins University. Our third speaker is Utsa Patnaik, Professor Emerita at JNU, and you probably know her not only for her studies on the agrarian question and contemporary imperialism, but also for her calculations of Britain's colonial drain from India. And our fourth speaker, external speaker, is Baba Aye, who is a contributing editor of Review of African Political Economy, co-convener of Nigeria's Coalition for Revolution, and is also a health officer for Public Sector International. The fifth speaker will be Kate Boons, who is the student coordinator of our Decolonizing initiative here, and has also been involved in these kind of initiatives in his previous university. Okay, so August, if you would like to start, I will try to change the settings of the video, so we'll see August. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. I encourage people, if you haven't seen it, in yesterday's New York Times, there was a special section on the protests here in the United States. And they printed a map, and you can go online and see the map where all the protests have taken place in all of the 50 states and in 2,000 locations. Protests have taken place. I think it's no exaggeration to say that what happened here in Minneapolis on Tuesday, following the murder of George Floyd, on Tuesday, beginning at 5 o'clock, the mass protests, May 26th, I think was the rebirth of the progressive forces. Keep in mind that we had been in lockdown for almost 3 months, and the indignation that generated the protests was what brought us back out into the streets. And there was a sense of liberation almost coming up for air in order to be able to express our indignation, to get beyond virtual meetings, to actually have real interaction in the streets. And that was the mood. And that mass mobilization of maybe 5,000 people was very multiracial. I would say that the majority of the people who protested were Caucasian, white, European, whatever label you prefer. And that was the reality. And it's important, again, to keep in mind the context, namely the pandemic. And so we all had to be conscious, especially people my age, and coming out in the streets and to protest. There was an element of risk with regard to health. We were able to, most of us, I think, wore a mask at the demonstration, but there was no way we could maintain the so-called social distancing. Nevertheless, exactly because what we had seen on film was captured on camera the day before the murder of George Floyd is what brought us out into the streets. And secondly, I think of, and again, I can't stress enough, and let me add a few words about that, the multiracial character of the protests. And that's what you'll see when you look at the map in the New York Times map. These protests are taking place not just in big cities, but in small towns throughout the United States. That's never happened before. Many towns that are majority European, white, Caucasian, whatever term that you prefer. And that's different than anything that's happened before around police brutality, marches and protests in the United States. For my generation, in the 1960s, anti-police brutality protests were exclusively African-American. There were no whites who participated. In fact, for whites who participated would have been dangerous. And that was the climate, that was the reality that existed then. And this is the first time we've ever had this kind of mass mobilizations, protests, in which so many people of Caucasian, white, European background have participated, as well internationally. That's new. That's, I think, of major significance. And it took place in the context of the pandemic, meant that people had to be conscious. You had to make a conscious decision to come out and protest, recognizing the risk with regard to health. Again, most of the left had been hunkered down for 3 months. And what happened here, I think, initiated a rebirth of the progressive movement. Also, too, a second factor of importance is that this took place in the reign, in the epocha of Donald Trump. As many of you know, when Trump was elected, there was a sense that when his election signaled in some way the triumph of white supremacy. I was in a minority. I disagreed with that view, but I was in a distinct minority. And what we've seen, these mass protests, it seems to me make clear that white supremacy did not triumph with the election of Donald Trump in November of 2016. To the contrary, what we see is a sea change in attitudes around police brutality in the United States. All the polls are showing that there's been a dramatic change in opinion about the police and what they do to Black people. That's new. That's of major importance. Also important in the United States, I think, is that these protests contrary to what is usual wisdom in the United States, which says that wait until November, wait until the elections that take place in November. If you have any kinds of complaints, problems, let's wait until November. That was belied by what actually took place. That is, people did not wait until November. They decided what I call to vote early, and they voted early with their feet, the most effective kind of voting. So that's of major importance also. And one of the challenges for the movement now is to make sure that this mass movement does not get sucked into the black hole of what I call bourgeois politics, especially the Democratic Party. And there are already voices who are already trying to channel all the energy in the streets to bring it back into electoral politics. So that's one of the challenges. But many young people are getting an education that you cannot get in a political science class. They've seen the effectiveness of being in the streets. Otherwise, these cops would not have been indicted. They would not be prosecuted had it not been what we did in the streets. And that's of major importance. I can't emphasize that enough. Lastly, let me just say, thinking about the bigger picture, about the question of the police and so on. Of course, the police is a class institution. It's been that way since the beginning of class society. But there are many people who are talking about what's happening in the United States, tracing it back to 1619, what I call the 1619 project. That is, that in order to understand what happened to George Floyd, you have to understand racial slavery. There's a problem with that. We have to be very careful about it, because 90 miles from the United States is another country where racial slavery existed, even longer than the United States. I'm talking about Cuba. And in Cuba, George Floyd's do not happen. That is, the murder of Black people of African origin simply doesn't happen. If you move further south in Brazil, yes, another country where racial slavery has a long history. Yes, on a daily basis, we see what happens to people of African origin with regard to the police. So Cuba is the exception. And so we have to think about that and realize that indeed history is not destiny. Just because the society began on a basis of racial slavery, there's nothing inevitable about what happened to George Floyd. It's exactly what the Cubans did in making a revolution, in beginning the process of getting rid of class society is why George Floyd's, the murder of Black people in the streets, doesn't happen in Cuba. So I think I'd like to end on that and pass it on to other people.
Thank you very much, August. Next speaker is Lester Spence.
Hey, so thank you all for having me. I really appreciate being here. I see some of my friends from around the world I haven't seen in a bit. And I want to give a shout out to the baby, Rebecca Friedman, who I don't know, has like a little baby. I swear to God, that baby must be like 2-3 months old. Shout out, way to get him young. First off, that is awesome. That is so awesome. That is dope. Sorry, seeing a little baby in the window just totally threw me off my serious groove. It's like I had one. Like, that is a straight up baby.
I didn't know we were visible.
Yeah, that is awesome. That is so awesome, Rebecca. Do the thing. So what I want to do actually is kind of related. What I actually want to do is talk a little bit about time and space and then political economy. Right? Time and space. So the first link in the chat room is a link that I shared with everyone because we didn't necessarily want to go through the bells and whistles of trying to share the screen. And what it does, somebody in around 2015 or 16 or so, basically geocoded thousands of tweets with "I can't shoot, I Can't Breathe, Black Lives Matter, and I think it was Stop, Don't Shoot. And they geocoded on a global map between approximately November 23rd, 2014 to December 5th, 2014. And within that 2-week period, you can see these hashtags both spread geographically from the United States across the world and then change in response to police deaths. That's the first time that we've actually, one of the first major time we've seen that type of global dynamic. Now, why do I start with 2014? Not just because it's convenient for the map, for the purpose of the map, but also because one of the arguments of Black Lives Matter in the United States and then the world, Occupy Wall Street in the United States and then the world, was that these were really, really limited social movements with no real political, with no real political foundation. That is, they came and they were gone. They didn't have political asks. They were largely decentralized. And as soon as the police or the state kind of tamped down on them, they were done, right? But what we're seeing with this is that it's not as easy as to make that claim. Certainly in the United States, we can't explain the rise of a Bernie Sanders, the increased membership of the Democratic Socialists of America, without going back to Occupy Wall Street. We've got more conversations about inequality now, even before the pandemic, than we've ever had. And then what the pandemic does is bring some of that rhetoric back. And with the Black Lives Matter protests, as soon as George Floyd was murdered, and it's important to note, it wasn't as soon as he was murdered, it was as soon as he was murdered and nothing happened. There was this huge gap between the murder, which everyone saw, and then actually the state stepping in to charge the officers, right? As soon as that happened, people took to the streets. But it's important to understand, particularly given the pandemic, that a pre-existing set of organizations had to happen, right? There had to be pre-existing organizations for people to take to the street and use really, really sophisticated tactics. So here's a way to think about it. I'm in Baltimore. Baltimore had the uprising in 2015. They had a rebellion in 1968 after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In 1968, the rebellion caused approximately $80 million in property damage. Hundreds of people were arrested, and there were actually, I think, several murders. In 2015, property damage by comparison was $1.2 million. There was no murders, and the only people that I remember were hurt were actually police officers that, for optic reasons, were told not to stand down. And in fact, a lot of that property damage was caused by police, right? One of the reasons that we talk about images now, at least in the United States, of rioting and violence is because if you actually looked at the data, you would see that there was very little property damage. The only people hurt were people either hurt by police, were police officers themselves, or were people who actually ended up becoming positive with COVID as a result of actually choosing to protest, right? So it's important to think about the way time and political movements, the way we talk about time and political movements, right? Now I'm gonna come back to that. August talked about the geography. It's really important to note the geography and the multiracial dynamics in the United States and elsewhere. And there, I think what we see is actually the power of not just social media, but the power of popular culture, right? So what popular culture can do is actually get us to reimagine what our interests are and to rethink what our actual identities are. So I live in Baltimore, but I'm from Detroit. And I was talking to a Detroit journalist, and he was telling me about some of the places that have protests in the Detroit area, and I was straight tripping. I was like, Troy, Michigan, get the hell out of here. Like, Troy, Michigan is straight up, really, really high income. It's becoming racially integrated, but still really, really high income, really conservative. They probably voted for Trump, but they have protests, right? How does that happen? What happened is popular culture actually creates a dynamic where when a wide swath of people see something, they can properly interpret it politically, right? They interpret it politically in ways that generate protest. So it's popular culture in those pre-existing social movements. Now, talking about political economy, and then after this, I'll get off. One of the things that happens, I think August is absolutely right. There are a lot of folks who want to use, in the American context, the frame of either slavery or Jim Crow, referring to the form of segregation prevalent in the mid-20th century in the United States, to explain what's going on now with policing. When what you really want to do is actually look at the neoliberal turn, right? So after 1970, you have this, we have the neoliberal turn where it rolls back social services, reduces the ability of labor to organize, significantly privatizes a range of services, and replaces a lot of them with police, right? And we see police budgets skyrocket. Detroit spends $300 million on policing. Baltimore here spends $500 million on policing. New York City spends $6 billion on policing. LA spends $1.2 billion on policing. Houston spends like about $1 billion on policing, right? What we see with this movement, with this particular variant, for the first time, is a really radical call to defund the police and to basically abolish both the police and the prison industrial complex writ large. That ask is actually translated politically. And for the first time, we see significant movement, right? So New York, for the first time, is cutting its budget, maybe about $100 million. You know, it's up for grabs. LA was going to raise their budget from $1.2 billion to $1.8 billion. I think they're now rescinding that. The state of Colorado just passed legislation that, among other things, makes it where police can only use deadly force if they are in an imminent threat of their lives. Whereas before, police had a broad remit where if they just had reasonable fear, not reasonable fear for the police, but like reasonable white boy fear of, reasonable regular person fear of the police, they can use deadly threat, right? That's changing. That signals that what we're seeing is the social movement actually translate into a political movement that can, with the defund of police, that can begin to help us rethink about other asks. So going back to New York City, at one point in time, the City University of New York was free. Now it costs $7,000 if you live in the state of New York. That's tuition. If you took that $6 billion police budget and just translated and just transferred that would generate to 840,000 students being able to go to the city of New York for free, right? So it's that type of dynamic that we're looking towards. However, there's some questions as to whether we end up going that way, in part because in this moment, it's not clear whether we're in 1955 in the American and the global context, where early 1950s, you had a wave of decolonization, at least 10 to 20 years of kind of new ideas about how to rejigger the economy, or we could be in 1968. Right, 1968, you had hundreds of rebellions all over the world, and we thought the revolution was coming, where in actuality, the counter-revolution was just a few years away. You know, Augusto Pinochet becomes president of Chile in a coup in like the early 1970s. New York undergoes austerity in the early 1970s, and it was a wrap. So on that note, hopefully we can have an interesting back and forth, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much. Also to the baby. And our next speaker is Utsa Patnaik. I think probably, Utsa, you need to unmute yourself, because I can't right now. Utsa, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I've unmuted.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you.
Hear me?
Yes, that's
okay.
Great, thanks.
So should I start?
Yes, please.
Yeah, well, Thank you for having me here today, and it has been very inspiring listening to the two first speakers talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. I would like to talk about the fact that, in my view, authoritarianism, repression, and inhumanity are endemic to globalization. So, which may not be very clear at first sight. So first, I'd like to say a few words about the earlier colonial phase of globalization, and especially the paper I've written, or rather the subject matter of the paper I've written about the massive famine in Bengal in 1943-44, which claimed 3 million lives, which was brought about by John Maynard Keynes's policy of deliberately inducing a very rapid inflation that he called a profit inflation, to achieve, in his own words, forced transferences of purchasing power from ordinary working people in order to reduce their own consumption and raise the savings necessary, that he thought necessary, for financing war spending. In Britain, the trade unions and the working class movement objected to his policy, and they prevented Keynes from implementing it. He switched to a policy of higher taxes instead, with the cooperation of the trade unions, but he did implement his policy in India. This callous and inhuman policy was carried out when the Allied forces entered Bengal from early 1942. Many hundred thousands of them poured into eastern India, that is Bengal province. Between then and 1943, if you look at the normal size of the entire colonial central government budget, in just 2 years' time, 7 times the normal budget was being spent for meeting the Allied forces' expenses in their military operations against Japan. And this was done by printing money. India lacked the technical capacity for printing money at this rate, so the rupee notes were actually printed in England, and then they were flown over in planes. A rationing system was set up for the people who were employed in the war industries and for the urban population, but the entire rural population, which was of course poorer than the urban population, was excluded from any form of rationing. On the contrary, grain was being sucked away from the rural areas. Most of the procurement was done from the hinterland of Calcutta in Bengal itself. So rice prices rose 6 times within 20 months. This is what was actually required, okay, in the abstract, in order to reduce the consumption of ordinary people, to raise forced savings, and Keynes says so in his own words. So who were the people who suffered? Obviously, the people who were dependent on the market for food, who were wage-paid laborers, poor peasants, artisans, fisherfolk, service providers, all of whom had to buy food from the market. And facing a 6-fold rise in basic staple food price in just a matter of 18 to 20 months, well, they sank into hunger, then famishment, and finally into death. So the ultimate toll has been estimated conservatively by Professor Amartya Sen at between 2.7 to 3 million persons. But if you look at the age structure of the population of Bengal at that time, 37% of the population consisted of children of 14 years of age and less. It was a young population. People didn't live very long those days. You know? And even if we assume that of the people who died, of the 3 million people who starved to death, not 37%, but a smaller percentage, let's say 30 to 33%, were children, because parents would have fed their children first. before eating the residues. Even then, nearly 1 million children under of 14 years and less in age starved to death in Bengal. And for what? So that 1,200 million pounds of resources could be raised for financing the allies. You cannot think of a more inhuman policy than that. The total war mortality in Britain, excluding Ireland, and over the entire period of the war, including combat forces, not just civilians, is estimated at around 460,000. So nearly 7 times as many people died in Bengal in just those 2 years, 1943-44, as over the entire war period in Britain. And yet you don't find this in any of the history books. This is the thing, that ideology is so important, you see. These unpleasant truths which the ruling classes at that time practiced are simply wiped off the history books completely. So I think intellectual struggle is very, very important here. I made a calculation that the alternative to these 3 million deaths would have been just 3 pennies a day per capita tax on the British population would have raised this sum. Because, you know, the per capita income in Bengal at that time was less than 1/30th of that in Britain. So it would not have been a big burden for Britain to bear. And after all, India financed allied forces. So if the USA had chipped in at that time, in that case, the additional taxation would have been less than 1 penny per capita per day. But no, as far as the colonial rulers were concerned, Black lives didn't matter. Indian lives didn't matter. So what if 3 million people died? It was all part of collateral damage. So the legacy of exploitation, discrimination is very difficult to get rid of. Our societies are marked by these ugly legacies of slavery, colonial exploitation, and in the case of India, also, of course, our own highly discriminatory caste system. But no matter how difficult, in order to be human and to build humane societies, we have to fight all these forms of discrimination. And that is why the Black Lives Matter movement in the US has become so important, globally important, also in the UK. Actually, I would say that all lives matter. Black lives matter because all lives matter. The lives of the 1 million Irish who starved to death in the 1846-7 famine, which was again a government-made colonial famine, those lives matter too. And you'll find it interesting, if you look at the 1984 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, I could not find any mention of the Irish famine under the history of Ireland. It's only when I went to the entry under potato that I found a mention of the famine. So this is the extent to which the reality of oppression and discrimination is actually completely wiped off from the history books. So if we come to the present, I would argue that, you know, if we ask the question, why do we see these movements, the BLM movement and other protest movements, coming up in such a large way now? I would say that it is because fascism is on the upswing everywhere. Obviously, on the upswing in Brazil, in the United States, in India, we have governments which have been described as neo-fascist in character. But this neo-fascism that we see today is itself the result, I think, of the past more than 4 decades of globalization in the North and 3 decades of globalization in my own country, in India. Now, there are many well-meaning people who think that globalization is good. They contrast it, they think that it's sort of building some kind of, you know, community between people across the world. And they contrast it to nationalism, which is a dirty word because it's associated with chauvinism. Nationalism is practically equated with chauvinism as far as modern writing is concerned. And it has these nasty connections to National Socialism in Germany in the interwar period, to Nazism. But I don't think that people realize that there is a very big difference between globalization, which is people-led, which we have not seen so far, which is a result of a coming together of working people everywhere, and a globalization which is finance-led. Because when you have finance-led globalization, then it is really recreating the same sort of repressive and authoritarian structures as we had seen, in the interwar period. Because what has it meant? Finance-led globalization has meant imposing austerity on societies everywhere, which has raised unemployment, which has increased poverty. And by the way, this entire kind of, talk about sharp reduction in poverty in the global south is complete nonsense. There's been no reduction in poverty. The poverty estimates that the World Bank puts forward and national governments put forward are all logically incorrect, because what they've been doing is they have been actually reducing the consumption standard against which poverty is being measured. It's like in a school. If the principal of a school tells you that we used to have 30% of students failing 30 years ago, now we have only 10% failing, so we are doing better. But when you look at how they've got those results, you find that the pass mark 30 years ago was 50 out of 100, and they've lowered it now to 10 out of 100. So the decline in the percentage of failures is solely a result of lowering the standard. Similarly, with poverty studies, there's been no decrease in poverty, in fact, a tremendous increase in poverty, increase in unemployment. And I will end by saying that I think there's been a kind of, ambiguity within the progressive movement with regard to globalization, which has cost us very dear. Because people on the left and people who want an end to discrimination have not realized that globalization is producing unemployment and poverty on a massive scale. So they have left a kind of space open, for the right wing to come in and to utilize this discontent to direct the anger of people, and a very legitimate anger, against the wrong targets, against minorities, against people of color, against immigrants, all the typical, diversionary tactics we find neo-fascists employed during the interwar period, we see again coming up in country after country after country. So it's a very difficult task, I think, because there's going to be a lot of pain everywhere. In my own country, there's been enormous sea change. Civil liberties have been, are being destroyed every day. People who protest against bad policies, earlier they used to be not given space to express their views on the media. Now they're simply put in jail. So this is something you find happening in other countries as well. And of course, we have seen the repressive role of the police and the threat to bring out the army in the United States. So let me stop there. I think I've used up my 10 minutes, and perhaps we can have a discussion on some of these points later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Utsa. And the next speaker is Baba Aye. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, the fire this time, as I like to see the current global uprising, is historic in several ways. I would want to zero in on four. First, we've never had this extent of a global response, even as has been pointed out, of even such upsurge in the US itself. But when you now look at the global picture, it brings out the depth of the anti-racist movement on ground. At the last count, over 70 countries. And in a lot of these, you have had tens of thousands of people come out to protest. You know, this in itself is quite a story, but it's also important to note that in the different countries, the protests have both been in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter and as well been used to bring forward questions to challenge racism and police brutality in those different countries across all the regions. In Canada, also in North America, there questions have been asked now about the questionable death of Regis Kosinski-Paquette, also Black in questionable circumstances where the police were called in. You have in Australia, the question has been raised of David Dunge, the Aboriginal who also was killed by the police in 2016. Incidentally, his last words to were, "I can't breathe." And they are asking questions of how and why over 400 Aborigines have died since 1991, have been actually killed in some way or the other by police. You know, in Germany, protesters are saying, "Germany, you are also not innocent," you know, pointing out the racist upsurge that you have had in recent times with the spike in migration, you know, in Germany. And you have had in Africa where the protest might have been more limited, but police brutality has also been called out for what it is. In Nigeria, you have had questions being raised with the police shooting of and killing a 16-year-old high school pupil a few days before George Floyd was killed, Tina Ezekwe. The killing also in January of Alex Ogwe, a member of the SWL and a journalist, as well as also using the opportunity to raise questions about increasing sexual violence and femicide. So it is showing how a spark leads to a conflagration addressing, you know, several issues in different countries related to and flowing and going beyond this. Thirdly, is that, you see, moments like these, in practice, you have mass critique of not only contemporary issues, but also, you know, history. As the movement seeks to redefine itself with a poetry of the future, it addresses, critiques, and shames the past. And that is where the issue of David Colston's statue, for example, comes into play, as well as, Leopold's in Belgium, and so on and so forth. It is a shame, you know, that you had, after slavery was ended, the slaves are not those that were enslaved, we are paid reparations. You know, we're talking of 23 billion pounds in today's money, which was 40% of the budget of the UK. So these are issues that have been addressed, because those who try to define history as the victor, so to speak, it is not just that they are looking backwards, and it is not just the disgrace of that to humankind, but it's that they are ideologically shaping what is considered to be apt today and for tomorrow. So in challenging this, in challenging the status, but also the need to go beyond the status, as someone said, even before they dragged the Colston statue, I said, the statue might be, but their children, their heirs are in parliament, you know. So we need to pull down the statues and pull down the living heirs of those whom the statues represent. Now, another important point is this: the fact that you had this mass uprising within the pandemic, it is in itself awesome. A minister in Canada was saying that, look, at least look at one good part, one good side of the pandemic. Now we can get away, you know, with the Santas, and so they felt, even in the United States of parts of North America, you saw Trump pushing through, you know, environmentally bankrupt, you know. So the fact that you had this, it is not only important, but it shows, this you could say is an audition, is a rehearsal for a global confrontation. And why I say so is that along with the global public health emergency, you're having a socio-economic crisis that is still emerging. As we say in Nigeria, it is still doing press up. It will soon start to run. And what we are showing now is that, look, we are ready to and we'll fight. You know, what we are showing now is that despite the pandemic, the spirit that geared 2019 into a fighting, year full of uprisings around, is not only alive, but moving forward. Now relating this to the issue of the anti-racist, I want to speak to two things. I agree totally, and it is very important to point out the multiracial character of this protest and that all lives matter. But often what is after 7 is much more than 8, because this you have had some sections of the left will say, try as much as possible, even when they agree it is anti-racist, but to remove the importance of the fact of an anti-oppressive of oppression. A kind of what I would say a vulgar materialism of that. Look, it is strictly working class. Yes, but what we're talking about here is that a socialist revolution itself is not a silver bullet. It's not like a religion of that the proletarian is Christ on the crucifix of capitalist exploitation. When it then resurrects with the revolution, everything is fine. We have to think through addressing different aspects of oppression without losing sight of the primary, role of exploitation in structuring oppression in general. So it is not a contradiction to, maintain the class analysis as primary. Also addressing the fact that there are specific forms of oppression. There's racial oppression, there's oppression of women, and the need to engage with this, to fight against this, and to see how superstructural elements could attempt, are even used to reinforce, the more fundamental questions of class, of economics, and so on and forth. And with regards to the Black Matters, all lives matter, yes, but it is like this: you are in a slum, every house is in tatters, and every house needs to be refixed, but the government has failed to do this. Then a particular house is on fire, and people are pouring water to douse that fire. We're saying all house matters on that street. Yes, every house matters. But we're saying that at that point in time, this also serves to draw attention to the state of disrepair of the entire slum as a whole. So it's not that all lives, Black Lives Matter, it does not undermine the question of all lives mattering. And back to the issue of historic significance as well. Something like defunding the police that has been raised. These are things that have gained, such currency in public discussion. And these are important because to change the world, we need to popularize possible alternatives. And tying the defunding of police, for example, to an issue of what then? The full Robocop-like gear of a police officer is enough to get at least 31 nurses, full protective, personal protective equipment, including N95 respirators. Yet you have CDC guidelines, which push for people who are treating COVID-19 patients, except under, where you have aerosolized procedures, not to use N95 because of why? Because of lack of availability. Yet you will not see any police being sent out to go and shoot and kill people, to go and stop riots without being given with the excuse of lack of availability. That is nonsense. And we need to tie the threads together in pointing all this out. I'm checking the time. To sum up here, the question of where are we in the 50s or 1960s, what is to be done, what could come out of this emerges. What I want to say here is what emerges from all this depends a lot on the balance of power and how far we go, the context. And this is why it is important here, 2 minutes. This is why it is of exceeding importance here. I have always been curious at looking at, after the Great Depression, you had you had the bourgeois being ready to reach some concession or come up with the New Deal, the Keynesian welfare nation state, some form of social compromise, which unraveled in the 60s, in late 60s, 70s. But when you had the Great Recession, they were able to get away with insisting that the remedy was more of the same bullshit concoction that got the world to where it was in the first place. Why? It was not because you didn't have fight backs. It was not because you didn't have mass movement. It was partly questions of organization, but also partly the extent of the dominant vision popularized within these movements. The movements of the Great Depression era, these were movements that were overtly revolutionary, anti-systemic, post-capitalist, and decidedly socialist. And that is why you had a member of parliament in the UK say, look, if we don't give them reforms, they will give us revolution. So how far we go depends on quite a number of things, but it also depends on how much we can inspire the masses, inspire youth to dream dreams, have visions of what is possible, and fight like crazy to win this. So I'll stop at that point in time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Baba, and thanks everyone. Cage, do you want to intervene, say a few words? And then I saw that Brian Kelly had his hand up, so I will call him.
Hello, everybody. My name is Cage Boons. I'm a student at King's. I'm studying international political economy, and I'm the student facilitator on the Decolonizing the curricular project. Outside of just making a brief statement, I wanted to facilitate conversation, particularly trying to elicit a student perspective on how they felt these events have been impacting them on a personal level. But before I sort of open the floor to some of students who said they want to contribute, I want to just speak on something that I think is particularly pertinent, which is performative activism. Something I've witnessed definitely throughout this whole episode in human history is the widespread support of the movement, which I think is brilliant. But I think below that we have an incredibly hostile social atmosphere that people who can't speak or who may not have an opinion are forced to have an opinion. So we're having support for a movement that isn't always genuine. And that's bringing up this performative activism I'm speaking about. So I want to get a student perspective on that. And yeah, really try to understand how both Afro-Caribbean students and non-Afro-Caribbean students have felt about this whole movement, particularly in the UK context. So I'd love to open the floor to any student who feels confident enough to share their opinion.
Way. Does anyone else want to intervene about these?
Could I intervene?
Yes, sure.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Joy. So I'm a third year student at King's. I study European Studies, and I'm a diversity and inclusion ambassador for the Department of European and International Studies. And relating to the point about performative activism, I think that's such a good point, because I've been in discussions with people who had previously expressed racist sentiments to me and offensive language less than a couple of months ago. And now that everything with the Black Lives Matter movement is starting to take off, these same people are posting on social media, talking about how to be allies, how to support the movement, resources to read. And I think it's really interesting. Firstly, I think it's good that people have the confidence to speak up, and I would hope that they're speaking up from a pure conscience because they actually want to change. But I feel a lot of the time it's surface level, and some people feel as though they have to say something because if they don't say something, they'll be looked down upon. So as diversity and inclusion ambassadors, we're currently collating a bibliography of sources relating to racism, anti-racism, student experiences within the UK in higher education, and how we can target the microaggressions. Because what I think this movement has really highlighted the fact that, yes, we understand that police brutality is wrong, we know that murder is wrong, but a lot of students, especially at King's, are unable to recognize the daily occurrences that happen within university. And I think it's more than being called names. It's also the microaggressions. It's also the lack of accessibility of Afro-Caribbean students to higher education. It's also just lack of opportunities for students, which I think need to be realized in an institution such as King's. We're also looking at making a forum for students where students who have concerns relating to not only race, but sexuality, gender, disability, religion, etc., etc., can just speak up and share their experiences. But I think for an institution such as King's, which prides itself as being very inclusive and welcoming, having a large international student background or cohort, I think it's super important for them to recognize the difficulties that students are facing now, having to sit exams in the middle of a pandemic, as well as being in the middle of a so-called race war, and then the impact of that to students' mental health, which I think is really important. And I definitely think that decolonizing the curriculum and starting to include academics that can work with students and foster an open dialogue with them is really important.
Can I just add to that? Sorry, I'm one of the second diversity and inclusion ambassadors from the EIS department. And we've also just been looking at if there's a way to create some kind of a safety net that facilitates an environment where students feel comfortable to bring issues to the institution without being without feeling that they're not being listened to genuinely, or that their problems are being kind of pushed aside because they're uncomfortable. And also just if we can create an environment where in any kind of situation where if a non-Afro-Caribbean student or a non-BAME student feels that they're also able to come forward and speak against racism that they experience without it having to be purely the person who the racism is directed against, if we can create some kind of environment that students can also feel that they can also say something.
Yeah, definitely.
I think really, really good points, Joy. Lastly, before I round up, I just wanted to sort of speak on another thread, and I think the thread that's been really pertinent in this particular situation is like victimhood, and I think us as a group always being characterized as a group that's historically been oppressed, and I think that is true. But as we seek to create a new identity for ourselves, this reactionary response that's primarily coming out of guilt when it comes to the performative activism, I think is ultimately going to be more harmful for us as we seek to emancipate ourselves from the oppression that we faced throughout history. So yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Thanks, everyone. I have two hands up and one person who asked to intervene. So first is Brian Kelly, who raised his hand a while ago, and then Raisa, who was from Rio de Janeiro. Brian?
Yes, thanks, Lucia. I wasn't going to say this, but given what the students have just said, I think it's important. I'm in the UCU and a member of staff at Queen's in Belfast, and you know, it sounds like the discussion that we're having at the moment is very similar to what is the discussion going on at King's. We're expecting a statement from our VC. It was supposed to be yesterday, but it may be today, you know, coming out to try to align the university with Black Lives Matter movement. And this is an institution which really hasn't, you know, its only attention to recruiting a kind of diverse student population, and Belfast is less diverse than many other places. It has been whether there are fees that they can bring into the university along with international students, wherever they're from. So we're trying to prepare, you know, we can see this not only in the way university VCs are trying to align themselves, but in the US, many of the kind of low-wage corporations that make their, you know, that have made their fortunes out of exploiting Black and Latino labor, and which have, you know, played a major role in perpetuating a kind of low-wage economy, imposing the kind of desperation that we see manifesting in the movement in the US. They're deeply implicated in all this. So I think the movement does have to confront that there are, you know, unsteady allies and people that have a stake actually in holding up the status quo, who are attempting to align themselves with the movement, and we need to be on the lookout for that. the 2 points I wanted to make very quickly. The first is, I think you can't help but be struck by how quickly the reaction to the George Floyd murder, and of course that was just the last in a long line of murders, and not the last, there have been many since, but the one that really broke the dam, that it's incredible, really, for somebody who's been involved in left politics for 40 years plus, how quickly this movement has actually transformed the political landscape, not only in the United States, but globally, I think. And it's obviously it's a very long time coming, but already in terms of its power, in terms of its, the kind of demographic spread, the popular support for a movement, aimed at some fundamental change, in many ways, it surpasses what we saw in 67 and 68 in the United States. Whether that'll be sustained is another question, but it's an incredibly potent moment, I think, for anybody that's hoping to change society. And it also reveals, in a very stark way, I think, the incredible gulf between formal politics in the United States, such as it exists, a Republican Party flirting openly with fascism, and a Democratic Party determined to put forward a centrist candidate who's himself deeply implicated in the whole law and order regime that has, brought us to this point. The huge gulf between that regime, two-party system, and, as we now see, millions and millions, tens of millions of the most oppressed, the poorest, large sections of the American working class, led by Black and Latino folks at the sharp end of the whole thing, but also involving a whole generation of young people who see that their future has basically been cast aside for in pursuit of, globalization for profit over the years. And that's an incredibly, I think we can see how this has kind of grown incrementally. Occupy, partly manifested in the Sanders movement, but this is something of a different magnitude, I think, we see unfolding. And as one small example, if you look at the reforms that have been delivered, even in the 3 weeks since the George Floyd murder, they surpass anything. Even if they, eventually they'll be whittled away and all that, they surpass anything we've seen at any time in the last 50 years around police reform. This is over a period of 2 or 3 weeks. And to me, the exciting thing about this, one of the many exciting things, is that a whole generation of people, tens of millions of people, especially young people in the US, have a taste of the power of a social movement that can actually deliver. We've said it as socialists, for a long time, but actually we see this kind of being borne out in the world in front of us at the moment. So that's the point about this gulf between formal politics and ordinary people. The second important point, though, is I think it's absolutely right, as many of the speakers said, to situate this movement or to cut against the idea that this is just about police brutality or about racist police brutality, even though that's very clearly at the center of some of this. In many ways, what we see is the kind of cumulative outrage over the whole regime of neoliberalism and austerity in the way that it's smashed people's hopes and dreams over a period of 25 plus years. And that rage is being rolled into, and I think drives the incredible power of the movement that we see throwing up. So I think situating it that way in terms of neoliberalism, globalization from above, et cetera, all that, absolutely essential. But it seems to me, talking to people in the US, where I'm from originally, and also following on social media through our own kind of agitation here in Belfast and across Ireland, and what I see elsewhere, that although that is the case, that this is part of a broader story of social and economic assault, that's not the political perspective that dominates the movement at the moment. And instead we get, well, and I've seen it in Belfast in the last few weeks, quite a hostile.
Sorry, excuse me, Brian.
Yes?
Yes, I think you need to conclude because there are many people.
This is it.
Yes.
This
yes.
is all I'll say.
Sorry.
That's really just a question. What about this gap between the way we analyze the movement and the actual politics that we see playing out in the street? And how does socialists effectively engage in a sensitive way to try to steer the thing towards, class politics? Thanks. Sorry to go on.
Thank you. Sorry for interrupting. I wanted to call Raisa Ruas from Rio de Janeiro. Raisa, are you here? She doesn't have a very...
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, everybody. I have a really bad connection, so I will keep my video off, right? And yeah, I was just writing the chat because I think my connection will not sustain, but I'm from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And actually, I would say a few words about the movement here and ask two questions. So actually, since the movement started in the US, we are also trying to organize and make it happen here in Rio. But we are facing different situations, of course, because of the character of our dependent capitalism. And one very close similarity between US police and Brazil police is, for say, while in the Los Angeles, one of the most, I think the most lethal police departments in the US, while they have killed 601 persons in the last 7 years, Rio police killed 606 from January to May this year. So what we have in common is that both killings came from in this context of rising police budget, as Lester said, and at the same time, in both cases, we didn't have policeman convictions, criminal convictions. So in LA, in Los Angeles, only one policeman was convicted. And in Brazil, we have none from these 606 killings. So what is the whole of the criminal system and the justice system in this ongoing genocide of Afro people in diaspora, right? And in the second, my second question was about what is the whole of imperialism in making those police more and more militarized and increasing not only the budget, but the kind of training to kill they receive, the kind of military apparatus they are using against us. So during COVID here, we have a very strict social isolation in Rio, despite of Bolsonaro politics. And even with social isolation, even with Black people at home, the police came to our houses to kill us, right? So that is the main reason we are out in the streets. But surprisingly, great part of Black movements and social movements, institutionalized left in Brazil, are opposing our protests, saying that if we go to the streets now, we are open to Bolsonaro gives a new coup. So the military coup will be the result of Black uprisings. And actually, this discourse comes together with a very bourgeois electoral politics as an alternative to police murders, because at the same time, we don't believe in the justice system, we believe in the bourgeois electoral system. So can you address those contradictions? Sorry if I took so long.
Thank you, Raisa. Thanks for your excellent intervention. I will call a few people. I'll ask you to be brief because there are 6 people who would like to intervene. And then I'd like also to give back the possibility to the initial speakers to get back to you. And I just wanted to let you know that Professor Utsa Patnaik will need to leave at, what's the time now? Sorry, I'm a bit confused with the time zones, but she will need to leave at 4:30 our UK time. Okay, so Rachel, then John Smith and Bene. John Smith, do you want to intervene?
Yes. Hello, thank you very much, Lucia, and thanks to the speakers. I just want to make the point the Bengal famine is happening today. Imperialism is today inflicting a giant Bengal famine on the peoples of the South. And a good example of it can be seen in a cup of coffee. $2.50 for a cup of coffee in the United States. 1 cent of it, 1 cent alone, goes to the coffee farmer. According to Financial Times calculations, that is not enough to cover their cost of production. In fact, it would need to double in Central America for them to cover their cost of production. So they are starving. They leave their land and join migrant caravans to get into the United States. $2.48 out of the $2.50 appears in the GDP of the United States or of the UK, which they use to pay for their universities and their healthcare system and for their military. So there is a massive, gigantic confiscation of wealth created by poor people in oppressed nations being confiscated by imperialism today. And it is just frustrating in some ways that this fantastic movement still discusses imperialism as if it was something of the past, not of the present. Anyway, I'm just going to post a quick link to an article that in 1,000 words sums it up, so you can have a look at it. But thank you very much, and let's see this fantastic movement grow and build and become 1,000 and 1,000,000 times greater. Thank you.
Thank you, John, also for posting the link to your article on this. Our next speaker is, I think, Bene. And then Maria from Brazil, I think, if Bene has some problems now.
I could start and then the other one could continue.
Yes, please, yes. Hi.
Okay. It was very nice to listen to Raisa talking about the movements in Rio. I was intending to talk about that and also bring into light the idea that there is a connection in Brazil. There is a historical connection between anti-fascism movements and anti-racist movements, because fascism in Brazil is very strictly connected with racism in its origin here. I believe it everywhere, but anyway, here it's very connected with the racism against Black people more strongly, because it had a kind of idea of idealizing the indigenous people connected to it. It was a very strange kind of fascism that was the origin of our fascism here. That was called integralism. But anyway, it was very important. And I think that it's not only the thing that Raisa put it out, it's not the whole left wing that is against those movements, but part of it that is more connected with this idea that she put it out, that the way out of the fascist period that we are living in is through elections. I don't know exactly why people believe that, but they do. Anyway, the thing that I was really wanting to ask you about was that here in Brazil, we are having a problem that is this online way out to go back to the education in our activities. I don't know how you were dealing with that out in England and America and everywhere, but here we have a very unequal society, and it means that most of the people, for example, that work or even that are students in our university don't have good connections, don't have equipment to access the connections, any kind of activities that we could be providing them online. So we are under a very fascist and against governmental measurement initiatives government, and this government is trying not to spend any money on education and on support to students. And at the same time, half of our students in the public universities where we don't pay to be in are from the very, the most poor part of the country, or in the most poor part of the rent share of the society. So do you have any idea how to deal with all this inequality regarding education under a pandemic situation without putting out all the Black people that was put in by all those politics that was intending to democratize the education in Brazil, when we say now, since we are in a pandemic situation, we are all online regarding education. Isn't it a violence against poor people that in Brazil are Black people too?
Thank you, Maria. Thanks. Thank you very much. I think I will call a few people before Andy and Malcolm. I think Helen and Sarah, and then I will call Andy, Malcolm. Raisa, do you want to speak again? Is your hand up again?
No, I think it's because I didn't took it off.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Okay, thanks. And then Oluzina and Tadiwa. Please, can you keep it very brief, because there are a few people who would like to intervene, and I'd like to give back the possibility to speak to the initial speakers. Okay, Helen?
Yeah, I hope it works.
Yes, yes.
Okay, yes, it's working. Yes, I'm just gonna repeat my question that I wrote, because I think it's very important to emphasize the fact that it's already awesome to see so many people protesting on the streets and big mass movements, even during the pandemic. However, I still have like this skeptical issue of what's happening afterwards, and that's why I'm in King's Decolonizing the Curriculum group, because I think the actions that come afterwards are also crucial, because we have already seen such movements before. And the fact that nothing happened afterwards was like what was lacking for me. So I think it's really a point that we have to discuss what crucial actions can be taken from the movements we see now. And for me, that's something that's not being discussed enough. We tend to concentrate only on the actual uprising, but the actions are not being discussed that can come afterwards. So that's just like a question that I wanted to ask in general for everybody to reflect what we can take from there and how we can keep this mass collaboration and mass movement, but with concrete actions.
Thank you, Helen. I think this is a great question. I was saying at the beginning that we'd like to issue a statement after this meeting, also as a UCU branch, and maybe in collaboration with students, if you're up to it. So maybe some people here who would be happy to carry this on could volunteer, and we could maybe also, I agree that we should also think about concrete actions we want to implement, but at the same time, so maybe this is also an opportunity to keep up some form of collaboration after this meeting. So if you'd like to, please add your name here in the chat or get back to us after this meeting. Yes, I just wanted to read Bene's question because she can't actually intervene. And she was mentioning even Ifekoya's withdrawal of her label due to the combative racism at Goldsmiths. So I don't, to be honest, I saw that someone posted a link about it. I didn't follow this, but so this is a question whether we should withdraw our labor in solidarity, which is of course an important question, also given the racialized impact that non-renewal of contracts or dismissals will have on our colleagues of color. So the next person I'd like to call is Sarah, and then Andy, Malcolm. Sarah, are you here?
Hello. I'm wondering if you're calling my name, Sarah Hakimas.
Sarah, yeah.
Okay. I mean, I already wrote the question, but let me ask it again. First, I want to thank the speakers from the US who were kind enough to join us early in their morning. And I just wanted to ask them what kind of role gender plays right now within the Black Lives Matter movement. Although we don't have any Black women joining us in from the US, I still want to ask our male colleagues how they consider the role that gender plays, especially these days. And my impression is that Black women who used to play very strong role in organizing at the backstage are now taking the role of leading the movement. And I wonder if they agree with me and how they reflect on the role that Black women play right now on the streets and leading the movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, this, especially when you organize meetings at very short notice, the composition of the panels is a bit random. So
I totally get it. Yeah, yeah.
So Andy Higginbottom. And Malcolm. Malcolm, do you want to intervene while we wait for Andy?
Guys, all lives matter.
I'm sorry, I was playing with my mute button. I think the connection between imperialism and Black Lives Matter, which was raised by all the opening speakers, is really important to ask about in terms of theory. And I mean, I was particularly pleased with what Ayababe and Utsa were saying in terms of the colonial experience of, you know, lives being destroyed, basically. And I really draw attention to the work of African-American women as theorists of this. So, for example, Claudia Jones and others have been writing for a long time now about labor superexploitation. And what it does is it brings in, within the sort of the conceptualization of traditional Marxism, the question of oppression in a very integral way. And I think it also unites, if you like, in a very integral way, the possibility between anti-colonial struggles and struggles against racism in the metropolitan centers. So I think they made a real contribution which has not been properly recognised and needs to be done. So I'd recommend going back to Claudia Jones and the early works of Angela Davis for that. And then secondly, I just want to say something about British racism and the wonderful bringing down of the statue in Bristol. Right? I mean, I think we should be talking more about what we should be doing specifically in Britain as well, not to deny everybody else's contribution. But the movement needs to go here from beyond statues to structures of imperialism. And in particular, Cecil Rhodes was crucial to contemporary British imperialism. And they will unite, the ruling class will unite to defend him. I mean, Utsa's contribution on Bengal is particularly appropriate because of Winston Churchill's role as the butcher of Bengal. So I think we should be drawing attention much more consistently to the colonized lives have been destroyed by British imperialism.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much. So I see that Natasha Stewart from the US also offered to give her perspective as a woman, Black woman from the US. So I will call Malcolm and then Oluzina, Tadiwa, and then Natasha.
Okay, thank you so much, Lucia. I am a staff member at King's, and I've spent 40 years in higher education. And all I can say is I love my students. I want to see them engaged and involved. And this is what we do. 70% of my students are non-British. It's a fantastic situation. Going into any library, whether it's at UCL or LSE or KCL, every language under the sun is there. It's fabulous. All lives matter. I hate to think of what's happening in the other city that I love very much, Detroit, where I go very regularly and where I have great friends. And honestly, I want people, my kids, my students, to be involved. I also want my staff, fellow colleagues, to be involved. Keep at it.
Thank you, Malcolm. So, Oluzina Adeniyi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, yeah, hello. My name is I'm actually happy about this program we're having today, and because I am a medical. I'm a radiographer by my profession, so I work in the health sector in the UK, and I'm also involved in diaspora organizations like the MANSAG, which is the Medical Association Nigerian in Great Britain, and also the Nigerian radiographers in diaspora. And I was invited here by Baba Aye, the co-convener of this, because we are also involved in the revolutionary struggle in Nigeria. And what I can see here, I would like to point on two, three things very briefly. First of all, on the destruction of the pulling down of the statue in Bristol, what actually made me happy about it was the fact that it wasn't done by mostly blacks. If you look at the video and the pictures of that event, you will see that over 80% of those that did that were actually white people. And it actually made me so happy, because this struggle will not be fought by the descendants of that injustice, but also by people who have actually renewed their minds.
I think he froze or somehow is not here. So while we wait for...
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah. I think it's probably better if you...
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, if you switch your video off, Yeah, it's probably better for the connection.
Okay then. Okay.
Yeah, and please.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Is it better now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I would like us to do is, apart from the struggle against imperialism, a struggle for the Black Lives Matter issue will have to be fought by people of diverse cultures, people of diverse mind. I'm happy that here on this particular program we're having today, we are all diverse and we are united in fighting against imperialism and the result of imperialism that is still in our society. And at the same time, I also like to maybe, I'm sure some of you will be aware of some of the effect, the COVID-19 effect on the BLM community in the UK, and I think that is also mirrored in the US. Yeah, where we find that there was a committee set up to investigate, to actually look into the result of the COVID-19 effect in the BLM community, led by Professor Fenton. And the result was, the outcome was very, very shocking. And I'm sure you must have heard about that in the news, about how it affected the BLM community in a very negative way. And then one thing that also we've heard about how it affected the BLM, that Black people are 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than white, and it also the Bangladeshi community and other community. But one thing that was highlighted there was that the people that were born outside the UK are twice likely to die from COVID-19 from the BLM community. And I think we also need to look into this, because now the recommendation of that committee was not published. The government suppressed the recommendation of that committee, and they refused to highlight the racism we have in the society, especially in the NHS. I've worked in the NHS. I know that in the front line of the treatment for the front line of this COVID-19 struggle, most of those that are involved are ethnic minorities, are Blacks and ethnic minorities people. But if you look at the news, if you look at Sky News, BBC, trying to highlight the struggle by the frontline staff, they hardly show the ethnic minorities staff in the front line. It's all been whitewashed. I know that in the recent history of this World War I, II, the First and Second World War.
Sorry, Augustina. Sorry.
Yeah.
That's really interesting and very relevant what you say. I just ask you to be short, please, because we're really running out of time.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now, what I would like to round up is the fact that I would like us to look into the reason why we are having, if you remove socioeconomic factor out of it,
yes,
why are we having more ethnic minority affected by the COVID-19 in the UK and in the US and in other areas?
Yes.
What are the reasons that the government does know? What is it that they are trying to suppress? What are the causes that they are trying to suppress in this particular case? And we also like to broaden the struggle so that this thing, as one of the speakers spoke about, the effect of imperialism is still there with us right now, and we need to fight against that. Thank you.
Thank you, Augustina. I will give you a very short time for these interventions. I really apologize to the next speakers, but I would like to get back also to the initial speakers. So Tadiwa and then Natasha Stewart.
Hi everyone. This has been a really great conversation to be a part of. I really enjoyed taking part in it. So I had a few thoughts I want to just sum up, and I think that the way that this sort of Western society is set up, something like this happening, the mass protests all across America, all across the world, the fact that that's happening is so I mean, it's just something that we've never seen the scale of it before, obviously, as we've said, but I think it just shows the way that society is set up to not let people have this time where they can really think about what's going on and be angry and be moved to act. I think there's an article I was reading about necropolitics where it says that, you know, people are so stuck in their grooves of daily going to work and, you know, economics and politics that you're not supposed to have the space or the capacity to be like, I'm angry, and to act out against that. And I think it's really amazing to be able to see that masses of people, not just Black people, but, you know, all across the cultural lines and all across, you know, like states, we're seeing people just kind of join together and be united by not anger, but be united by seeing injustice and acting against it and acting to stop it. And I think especially in the time of the pandemic, seeing people kind of put personal, you know, putting themselves aside for a cause that's so much more important than a singular person is so amazing to see. And especially within the British sense, I think the system is kind of Britain has all of these things that makes it the way it is. And I feel like we've never really come to terms with the fact that the country is the way it is because of the history, because of imperialism, and because of the role that this country played in slavery. And it's so integral to the way that this country is, but we've never really had like a reckoning. And I think now more so than ever is the time for us to kind of come to terms with it and really do more than just stopping at Colston being toppled. We have to take down Winston Churchill. We have to take down Cecil Rhodes, especially for me as a Zimbabwean person. I'm very, like, I need to see Cecil Rhodes go in the next like year maximum, but I think we really have a great opportunity now. And I think it's one of those where we can't just let it, we have so much momentum and all of these things that was so like revolutionary and we thought we could never ever say on a platform, we can now say. So I think we should just take the opportunity and go forward, because I think this could be a real turning point where words turn into actions, turn into change. So yeah, that's what I have to say. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you. Natasha? John, do you want to get back to that?
Yeah, I just want to make a brief point around the UK movement. It's not a movement for statues, okay? Like the reality, and just to point out, Claudia Jones was from Trinidad and Tobago. My indenture and Caribbean crew just wouldn't let me get away without pointing that out. She's from the Caribbean. The movement in the UK isn't about statues, but it does face kind of real, you know, it faces hurdles to actualize what it's about. And in a sense, the statue of Edward Colston is about the erasure of value, right? It's about the erasure of the contribution of a whole bunch of people to the development of modern Britain, right? And the statue basically erases the enslaved contribution, which is huge to the industrialization process, and also other colonized people that helped build modern Britain. So taking it down is a recognition of value. What the movement has to do is to link that to the contemporary erasure of value, which, look, happens through wider forms of imperialism, but actually happens right here in Britain, and where you can make tangible links quite easily. I'm talking about the COVID-19 crisis revolving and basically, showing us how migrant labor is key to the provision of a national health service, to the way BME communities are found at the bottom and on the front line of those services, and also the erasure of value that happens at the border, right? The contemporary border problems that Britain encompasses itself in Europe. And so, like, the movement isn't about statues. It's about the erasure of value and the contemporary movements for Black lives, both within Britain and those who are left outside of Britain and outside of Europe. And so it's quite important to get that kind of through, that there isn't really a dichotomous thing of why aren't you talking about imperialism? You know, young 19-year-olds who go down on last Saturday to beat up neo-fascists probably aren't concerned about neo-imperialism, but rebellions can grow, and we can grow the movement via working with these kind of groups on the ground. So I just wanted to point that out, that in fact, you know, this is in the early stage of this, and we will need more of this as we're slightly different in the UK. We've had an electoral cycle which picked to go with a right-wing, reactionary, racist, nationalist, xenophobic government, and they're locked in for 4.5 years. They've also killed off 60,000 people. And they'll be looking to gain more and more of their money back via austerity. So in some ways, the movement here is a preamble for the struggle we're going to have to to have going forwards. And I think just saying it's about statues is wrong. It's about the erasure of value. How do we make those links between both our past and our contemporary? All right, cool.
Thank you, John. Yes, I think what John was saying was really the idea behind this workshop, so that this is not a struggle about the past, it's really a struggle about the future. And if they are still here, because I know we are running out of time, I would like to ask the panel if they can get back to these multiple questions, comments, discourses, speeches. August, do you want to start maybe?
Okay, sure. First, to Sarah's question about the gender question. Yes, you're absolutely right. Specifically the leadership role in the Black Lives Matter is extraordinarily diverse in terms of women playing an extraordinary role. We didn't see that in the 1960s, simply didn't. And so it registers the gains that came out of the progressive movements, progressive social movements of the 1960s. So we benefit from that. So briefly, yes, no, women play a prominent role in Black Lives Matter in the United States in a way that they didn't do in the 1960s. Yes, just on Black Lives Matter, the formulation I like best is that when Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. When Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. There's people who are at the bottom of society who've been historically discriminated, and when we can defend them, we defend everybody. I raise that now because sometimes people want to counterpose Black Lives Matter to all lives matter. And again, I find more useful the formulation that when Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. One thing I didn't get a chance to raise, and that we all should be aware of, and we didn't really talk about it. The capitalist world system is about to enter into a depression. A depression is on the horizon. In some places, it's already begun. And that will have enormous implications for politics. Enormous implications for politics. And I can't speak to the situation in India, because I've had discussions with colleagues about it. But in the United States, fascism is not on the rise in the United States. This movement, what we're witnessing right now, has pushed back the right wing. The right wing has been pushed back. It's been pushed back in a serious way. And again, I can't emphasize enough that this is happening under the Donald Trump administration. And exactly why some of us who were in a minority, we didn't subscribe to the notion that when Trump came into office, somehow white supremacy had triumphed. And what we're going through right now, it seems to me, is overwhelming evidence to confirm, indeed, that white supremacy did not triumph when Donald Trump came into office. And lastly, the Cuba question. Again, I want to go back to Cuba. In the Western Hemisphere, we have three societies where racial slavery was deeply, deeply entrenched: the United States, Cuba, and Brazil. And only in Cuba do you not have what takes place in Brazil and in the United States. That is, the police killing people, killing Black people. It doesn't happen in Cuba. Before 1959, it did. That was common in Cuba. But exactly because the Cubans made a revolution. The Cubans made a revolution that began to erode and to undermine the class inequalities, the class inequalities that existed before. And that's why I argue that we don't have George Floyd's, there are no George Floyd's in Cuba. The Cubans are still grappling with the question of race, there's no doubt about it, but there are no George Floyd's in Cuba. And I argue that we need to grapple with that and think about it in terms of how do we go forward, the solution. What is the real solution for ending police brutality?
Thank you, August. Lester?
A few quick points. So there's this political economy issue that we talk about. I want to talk about how it's unfolded within Black Lives Matter in important ways, and then how it's unfolded in gender, and then come back to the diversity thing on the back end. So first, it's important to note that with the police killings in the United States, what we're talking about isn't just Black people. Actually, it isn't just Black people. They kill a whole range of different folk. But it's primarily Black working class folk. Like George Floyd was a bouncer and a truck worker, right? Eric Garner sold loose cigarettes. Breonna Taylor was an emergency technician. Ahmaud Arbery, who wasn't killed by police, but police-like actors, wanted to be an electrician, but he couldn't pay tuition, so he dropped out. What we're talking about are working class folk, right? We don't talk about that enough. And on one hand, that's wonderful that we extend Black lives to cover them, but on the other hand, it's problematic because we're not really talking about the things that make them working class. So when we're thinking about in the policy stuff, we think about the policing, and we've really transformed how we talk about policing, but we haven't talked about a whole range of issues as to how those people's lives may be made better, as opposed to simply how we can prevent them from being killed. Now, how is gender unfolded in that? Now, we know that while I appreciate the say her name dynamic, it's important to note that out of every 100 Black people killed by police, approximately 4 of them are women. So it is a gendered violence that we're dealing with. And then the reason that women are responding to them and taking leadership roles is because at least since approximately 1980 or so, both in traditional politics, electoral politics, and in non-traditional politics, most of our growth in Black leadership in general has come from women, in part because of the effect that incarceration has on Black men. But what that means on the policy back end is even more important, that we actually extend our policy suite, not just to talk about things like policing, but to talk about things like rape kits. Like in Detroit, approximately 15,000 rape kits were found in an empty warehouse because not just because of patriarchy, but because the police department supposedly didn't have the money to test them, right? If we can extend that, the biggest challenge that Black women are facing are related to welfare. And you don't really have anybody talking about welfare, even during this moment, right? So even as gender has led to increased gender dynamics, we're talking about gender dynamics with violence, even as we see an increase of Black women being involved in this stuff, we still haven't seen that translate into a shift to talking about welfare policy. And that's the thing we're gonna have to think about going forward. Finally, on the diversity end, this is related. I am a university professor. I am a beneficiary of affirmative action. I teach the number of Black people who go to Hopkins, I can count, figuratively on 2 hands and 2 feet, right? So I get that. But one of the challenges with this moment is that there's an intraracial class dynamic within Black communities in the US and elsewhere, where we've got this universe of policies we want to deal with. But we've got these class dynamics that talk about what's important to us. Diversity and inclusion is not the same thing as police killings. They're not the same thing. Talking about microaggressions, I get that. That is not the same thing as a police officer's foot on somebody's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It's not the same thing as a $500 million police budget where we only spend $30 million on health. So and I write about intraracial class politics in Black communities. That's an important thing for us to really, really focus on, because otherwise what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this moment and then we're gonna end up shunting it off right? We'll have the policing stuff over here, the welfare left stuff over here, but then we'll have diversity and inclusion over here. And that ends up sucking up all the air. To that note, thank you for having me. I had a lot of other links that I put in the chat, and I'll continue to put in the chat. Thank you very much. August, I didn't know you were Black. This is dope. I got your books on my shelf. I was straight up looking to show you. I'm like, oh my God, August is Black. That's dope.
Well, that's good to discover finally. So, Baba?
Yeah, I'll just want to talk to one or two things quite quickly. One, furthering Lester's view and pointing out not just that we're talking about Blacks, but that we're talking about working class Blacks. I think it's also important to look at the criminalization, you know, that is used to justify such attacks. And for these, I flash back to when Black Lives Matter activists accosted Bill Clinton during Hillary's campaign. And that, look, how come you have Black males being 6.5% of the population and over 40% of the people in prison? And I mean, the arrogance with which he responded itself was offensive. But then the point was that, look, the people we sent to jails were the people that would otherwise have sold drugs to Black kids, killed Black kids, and all that kind of nonsense. I think it is important for us to show this for what it is. Fraudulent argument. I mean, there have been enough evidence to show that the war on drugs itself was a dog whistle. It was a coded attack on, you know, Blacks and Latinos in the rise of movements like the Black Panther parties and so to break their back, you know, of such resistance that emerged from the 1968 and it also shows the depth of poverty where you have a lot of people, you know, a lot of homes you have generations in prisons and things like that. I would encourage those that might not have films like, you know, 13th. They show you, when you watch some of these, you see the structural nature of what is now used as an argument of criminalization, and we need to stress this. The question always is what is to be done, and our interpretation and understanding needs to be geared towards this. So I think the issue that right now, part of what has come up is not just about the funding of the police, but the issue of abolition of prisons. And it is now not just a question that is arising within the United States. What does policing mean? What is the nature of the state? Who do these police serve? How indifferent, because we should be quite conscious, as August also pointed out, we are entering a period of what will be very sharp economic crisis. And the bosses are going to do everything possible, except there's adequate power, respect only power, according to Frederick Douglass, except we mobilize, continue this kind of power from below against them to make sure that poor working class people, Blacks, whites, brown, everybody, bear the burden of it. They were forced to take actions like nationalization of hospitals, or at least requisitioning this, converting production to need as against profit, you know, with regard to personal protective equipment and things like that in some countries. We need to say, how can we make sure that there's no going back on this, but we go further? Already, there are attempts to roll back this. So the arguments on the street, the arguments, we need to constantly tie the connections. And I will sum up now with an allegory I like to make. It's like if you were in hell and you want to negotiate with the devil for a better place in hell, the devil realizes that you're not serious at all. You're not serious. And you're not going to live where you were. But when you fight to get out of hell, when you fight for something beyond that hell, you could win. But even if you don't, the devil is forced to negotiate with you that, okay, I'm going to give you a corner with air conditioning in this hell. That was the context of the New Deal, of the Keynesian welfare state. How far we get depends, as I said earlier, on the vision of the movement here, and also organizations that advance this, that mobilize around this. And that is why, you know, the trade union movements, people have complained, like in the United States regarding the labor bureaucracy not wanting to kick out the people. We need to, as activists, keeping relations with rank and file workers, shop stewards, and so on and so forth. We need to ensure that what is coming out of this movement goes, deepens the anti-racist struggle, but goes also further to challenging the capitalist system in all ways and manner, with a vision of a better world. We used to say 20 years back, another world is possible. Now more than ever, we need to fight to win such worlds. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. If you want to unmute yourself and maybe make a bit of noise to conclude with, I think this was really an inspiring discussion. Some of you volunteered to work on a statement out of this. Thanks to the speakers, and thanks everyone for participating.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice meeting.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, Les, for inviting me.
Oh, you know I got you. This is what we do.
Thanks to everybody who organized this great session. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bring me back virtually and for real. For real.
Thanks.
Yes, Lester, tell Robbie I looked after you, okay?
Oh, yeah, I will. My man, yes. Yes, I will. Robbie Shillian, what up, though? Got you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thank you, Lucia.
Thank you.
Yeah.